When I was thinking about this first question at 7 this morning, I thought there's lots of ways I could approach it, and for some reason I decided I'm going to do this by talking about ancient Greek philosophy, but I will get to the point. So I'm going to talk about ancient Greek biology for a few minutes, but I will bring that back to the question. So before I ever read Gender Trouble, I read another book that was published in 1990 by a professor at Berkeley, Thomas Lacour's Making Sex, Bodies, and Gender, From the Greeks to Freud. Lacour shows that for much of Western history, there were two genders, men and women, but only one sex or one type of body, the male body. And when I teach this stuff on the having two genders but one body, I often teach it with Anne Fausto-Sterling's work on the 5 sexes. So just to sort of show the contingency of thinking the number has to be 2 when we think about gender and sex. So men and women were understood to have different social roles and functions, but just one type of body, the male body, with women's bodies being a slightly and an inferior variation on the male body. So Aristotle, for instance, infamously describes women as impotent boys and mutilated men. The female genitals were understood as the same as the male genitals, but located inside the body instead of outside, with the ovaries corresponding with the testicles and the vagina corresponding with the penis, and the female body simply lacking the right degree of heat for the genitals to be pushed outside the body into the most perfect version of the human form, which was the male body. And Aristotle talks about how this is a necessary mutilation. It's a mutilation, or it's inferior, but it's also necessary for reproduction to have these inferior forms. So it was assumed by most ancient writers that, and into the 18th century actually, that women, like men, had to have orgasms for conception to occur because they had the same kind of body, and that when they orgasmed, they emitted semen, and that female semen mixed with male semen to produce a baby. Galen wrote a whole treatise called On Semen, and part 1 of the book is on male semen and part 2 is on female semen. According to Lacour, it's only in the 19th century, with feminism, that gender roles came seriously under fire, that biologists decided that there had to be 2 distinct sexes or bodies to ground 2 distinct genders, or to justify why we order society into 2 distinct genders. It's because there are 2 bodies. So only then did the female body come to be understood as completely different from the male body in order to justify women being restricted to different social roles. And what's interesting about Lacour's book is that he shows that this wasn't like finally we understood that the female body is different from the male body, and I mean, some of it is better scientific knowledge about how reproduction occurs and so forth. Some of it, there is just as much scientific kind of arguments for the ancient Greek view. Like there are ways that the fetal development, these parts of the bodies are isomorphic and so forth, and a lot of it has to do with perspective, how we decide to represent the body. So there was a shift from depictions of the male and female body both being standing up, in which case, and it's as though you can see through the woman's stomach into her to see her reproductive organs, whereas now when we depict the female genitals, it's a gynecological view where the woman is lying down and you're like looking between her legs, and then things look very different than when you're looking at a male standing up. But if we take a different perspective, they can actually look quite similar. So it's not that we have just better science now, but we have different kinds of scientific drawings to justify a different view that underpins the two sex, two gender view of the world. And interestingly, a similar story can be told about biological constructions of race. It's only in response to oppositions to slavery in the 18th century that biological racism emerged to justify ongoing enslavement of Africans. So in the generation of animals, Aristotle argues that plants and some lower species of animals can be hermaphrodites because they lead such simple lives that just having one type of body suffices to do everything that species needs to do, including reproduce itself. In contrast, higher animals that move around and have sensation need to be divided into at least 2 types, male and female, because they lead more complicated lives. So they need gender differentiation in order to have a division of labor. And humans are the most complicated of all animals for Aristotle, and so we need even stricter divisions of labor between men and women than you have in other animal species, which is why male and female human bodies are more clearly differentiated than male and female badgers or bats, having more secondary sexual characteristics. Beyond this, nature also gives humans a 3rd type of body that other animals don't get, slave bodies. Although sadly in this case, for Aristotle, nature doesn't always make it completely clear who should be a slave and who should be free, the way it usually does in differentiating male and female bodies, though he also talks about there are cases where that's not so clear either, and you have what we say intersexed individuals now. So the more complicated the social lives of the species for Aristotle, the more necessary differentiated social roles are, including gender roles, and then the more nature differentiates our bodies to mark out who should have which social roles. So of course, I reject all of that vehemently, but what's interesting to me about reading Lacur, Aristotle, and Galen, and this is also why I like reading Foucault and genealogical work in general, is that it shows a wildly different way of thinking about sex and gender, and hence the contingency of our own way of thinking about them. In particular, instead of seeing gender as the social interpretation of the more foundational sex, for Aristotle, gender is what is primary, natural, or necessary, and sex is just something nature does, albeit inconsistently, to mark out those social roles. 2,500 years later, Lacur and Butler both published books from Berkeley in 1990 that, I think completely independently, that reject Aristotle's view of gender as natural and necessary, but agree with him that gender is primary with respect to sex, and that sex is just a way that we mark out and enforce gender roles. So when you asked me as well about for a phrase relating to gender to put on the poster, the first thing that came to my mind was the quote from Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, where she writes of the lesbian femme who likes her boys to be girls. And I think that's because I ascribe to her feminist Foucauldian queer view of gender, but also because I appreciated the recognition of gender not only as something compulsory and oppressive, but also as something we like. Gender can be pleasurable and playful. We're erotically invested in our gender and in other people's genders, and this erotic investment can be in transgressive performances of gender, as in liking boys who are girls or boys who have been girls. And of course, the focus on pleasure and desire is not simply celebratory, but is compatible with thinking about gender in terms of oppression and compulsion. So the next phrase that came to my mind after I'd already given you my first phrase was Foucault's writing about perpetual spirals of power and pleasure, and he's writing about sexuality there, but I think gender, like sexuality, is an effect of power, constituting not only our identities, but our pleasures and desires. So in answer to your question, I primarily think about gender as a radically contingent construct that in turn produces the secondary construct of sex. And I think about gender, like sexuality, as an effect of power, an effect that's compulsory and oppressive, pleasurable and performative, and to which we are deeply attached.